What's up, MMA fans on YouTube? I wanted to start by thanking Dan for inviting me to respond to his video, and also to Jeremy, who has already responded to his video, and now I've been invited to respond. Basically, the whole topic here is Pride versus the UFC and lack of respect by MMA fans, or so-called MMA fans, being shown towards fighters and whatnot. And I know I've recently done a video here addressing a couple of guys on YouTube with that very same topic. The main reason I did that video was to not to so much get on a soapbox and do this long-winded speech, this holier than thou thing. That's not the reason I did it. The reason I did it is because I didn't want these two guys representing MMA fans. For people to click on these videos and see this stuff and say, look, this is what I'm talking about. Look at the people who watch this stuff. I mean, come on, this is ridiculous. No, I didn't want that type of mentality to be perpetuated and that light to be cast on the rest of us that truly do love the sport and truly do understand it and enjoy the competition regardless of what it's presented by, UFC, Pride, what have you. And that was my main reason for doing the video. But on to the response to Dan's video. For me, the Pride versus UFC war is over, really. I think it's never really been a topic of discussion. I've done videos on it. I've never really let it enter my head, though. It was always like a thing where I think both organizations have perpetuated it too. When Pride was at its peak and the UFC was still trying to push through over here in the States to get more mainstream coverage, to get more of a novice viewer to tune in, you had them promising Couture, Vanderlei, Chuck. These fights never came to fruition, and just as recently as this past Saturday, Quinton Rampage Jackson versus Chuck, people largely viewed it as a Pride versus a UFC fight, whereas Quinton's a UFC contracted fighter. He's no longer in Pride. He hasn't been. He was contracted by the WFA, and that's how the UFC was able to acquire him. So he's a UFC contracted fighter, and Chuck is a UFC contracted fighter. So I didn't view it at all as it being a Pride versus UFC event. I think now with Chuck losing his title to Rampage and Dan Henderson now going to be fighting Rampage, now you're going to get to see like a whole explosion. I mean, you're going to see this whole thing blow up now. Everybody's going to be like, well, Dan representing Pride, Quinton representing the UFC, and God, who could have ever fathomed that? It looked like for a long time it would be, if anybody, Vanderlei or Shogun against Chuck, but it never happened. It never came down like that, and now we have what we have. And I think people need to just get over the fact of the whole Pride UFC thing. I think every sport goes through changes, and I think you continue to see MMA evolve and go through changes, as we've seen all sports do in their early stages of their organizations, like the NFL merging with the AFL, the whole Colts versus Jets, Namath making his bold prediction that they would win, and his guarantee that they would win, and they did. And a few years later they merged, and now you see what the NFL is to football. It's everything. It's the end-all be-all of football. You've seen it with basketball, the ABA and the NBA. The NBA's brash, wide open style of basketball, dunking, fancy passes, more of a showman type of basketball, as opposed to the NBA, where it's a more technical, more disciplined half-court style of basketball. Dunking was considered disrespectful, and nowadays you see the brand of basketball that's played in the NBA is a very wide open, in-your-face dunking style of basketball, where showing up an opponent is very common. So you see how much a merger can change a sport. And in baseball, with the entry of the DH into the American League, baseball purists to the day still hate the fact that the AL plays with a DH. They feel that it takes the strategy out of the game, the double switches, the pitching changes. So no matter how minuscule or how large a sport changes, there's always going to be changes. There's always going to be topics of debate. There's always going to be people who don't agree with what's going on. So I've just come to learn to accept that and just kind of roll with it. MMA is still very much in its infancy, and it's continued to grow. We've seen the growth just in the past months with the amazing coverage that it just recently got on ESPN, with the whole build-up to Chuck versus Rampage fight. Chuck and Rampage getting plug after plug, interview after interview. It was just great for us MMA fans to see the sport blowing up before our very eyes. And so I think everybody just needs to just relax on the Pride UFC debate. It's just, for me, a sport is a sport. It's competition. It is what it is, and we just have to learn to accept the way it is. Pride is now owned by the Fertittas, Zuffa, whatever, and the Pride brand might be gone. And like I stated in a prior video, if it is indeed gone, UFC fans, whether if you like Pride, you embrace Pride, or you hate Pride, you have to thank Pride for continuing to keep the interest in MMA alive. Back during the dark days of the UFC, when they were off pay-per-view, they were blackballed by mainstream media, considered, like most boxing people now do, a human cockfight. And Pride was selling out arenas in Japan, like 40, 50,000, and putting on great cards, great pay-per-views. Many of us would stay up late in the early morning to watch these pay-per-views. So, and kept interest alive via the internet and pay-per-views. So we really have to thank Pride in some way for what they've done for the sport. And there was a time where one really justified the other. You couldn't have the UFC without Pride, and you couldn't have Pride with the UFC. It just, they went hand in hand, regardless of how similar or how different. Soccer kicks on the ground, stomps on the ground, no elbows, or elbows on the ground with no soccer kicks and stomps, a ring versus an octagon. Whichever was more aesthetically pleasing to the eye, people gravitated towards. So you're always going to have people who differ, but I think for myself, it's pretty much black and white. It's MMA. I enjoy the competition and I love watching it. And onto the fans, the lack of disrespect, the fans booing and whatnot at MMA events, or just a lack of respect overall. I think, if you shell out the money to go sit at a live event, or shell out the money to buy the pay-per-view, you're entitled to your opinion, you're entitled to boo. And you're always going to have booing, regardless of whatever. I mean, like myself and Dan and Jeremy, us making videos on YouTube, putting ourselves out there, stating our opinions and our thoughts about the sport, we'd be naive not to think that we're not going to get negative feedback or negative criticism, or get cussed out from time to time by people who don't like our opinions and our views about the sport. That we'd be insane not to think that's going to happen. Just like with mixed martial artists, if you think you're going to go out in front of 20,000 people, have millions of viewers on via pay-per-view watching you, you'd be naive not to think you're not going to get booed from time to time. You're not going to have people wanting to see you get knocked out, or people wanting to see you knock your opponent out. So I think that you're always going to have that. That's just I think you're fighting a losing battle with that one. You're always going to have fans that don't understand what they're watching, regardless of the sport. You're always going to have fans that boo. So it's just something that MMA fans as a whole need to learn to accept. A lot of Vegas fans, a lot of the pay-per-views that are held in Vegas, the majority of them are. A lot of novice fans go to these events. A lot of these tickets are comp tickets by the hosting casino and hotel. So you're going to get pretty much the live audience is going to be largely consist of the novice fan. So with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video response. Again, I want to thank Jeremy and Dan for their past and present work, and thank the rest of you MMA fans for the large positive responses I've gotten as of late. I really appreciate it. I try to get to each and every message and respond to you guys as prompt as I can, and thanks for all the positive feedback on the videos. I'm gonna try to keep doing my best to keep you guys watching. So until then, you guys have a good one and take care.